PART II. Combray. § 13. When we had decided to go the Méséglise way, we would start, without undue haste, and even if the sky were clouded over, since the walk was not very long and did not take us too far from home, as though we were not going anywhere in particular, by the front door of my aunt's house, which opened on to the Rue de Saint Esprit. We would be greeted by the gunsmith, we would drop our letters into the box, we would tell Theodore from Françoise as we passed that she had run out of oil or coffee, and we would leave the town by the road which ran along the white fence of Monsieur Swann's park. Before reaching it we would be met on our way by the scent of his lilac trees, come out to welcome strangers. Out of the fresh little green hearts of their foliage the lilacs raised inquisitively over the fence of the park their plumes of white or purple blossom, which glowed, even in the shade, with the sunlight in which they had been bathed. Some of them, half concealed by the little tiled house, called the Archer's Lodge, in which Swann's keeper lived, overtopped its Gothic gable with their rosy minaret. The nymphs of spring would have seemed coarse and vulgar in comparison with these young houris, who retained in this French garden the pure and vivid coloring of a Persian miniature. Despite my desire to throw my arms about their pliant forms, and to draw down towards me the starry locks that crowned their fragrant heads, we would pass them by without stopping. For my parents had ceased to visit Tansonville since Swann's marriage, and so, as not to appear to be looking into his park, we would, instead of taking the road which ran beside its boundary, and then climbed straight up to the open fields, choose another way, which led in the same direction, but circuitously, and brought us out rather too far from home. One day my grandfather said to my father, "Don't you remember Swann's telling us yesterday that his wife and daughter had gone off to Rheims, and that he was taking the opportunity of spending a day or two in Paris? We might go along by the park, since the ladies are not at home. That will make it a little shorter." We stopped for a moment by the fence. Lilac time was nearly over. Some of the trees still thrust aloft in tall purple chandeliers their tiny balls of blossom, but in many places among their foliage where, only a week before, they had still been breaking in waves of fragrant foam, these were now spent and shriveled and discolored, a hollow scum, dry and scentless. My grandfather pointed out to my father in what respects the appearance of the place was still the same, and how far it had altered since the walk that he had taken with old Monsieur Swann on the day of his wife's death, and he seized the opportunity to tell us, once again, the story of that walk. In front of us a path bordered with nasturtiums rose in the full glare of the sun towards the house, but to our right the park stretched away into the distance on level ground. Overshadowed by the tall trees which stood close around it, an ornamental water had been constructed by Swann's parents, but, even in his most artificial creations, nature is the material upon which man has to work. Certain spots will persist in remaining surrounded by the vassals of their own especial sovereignty, and will raise their immemorial standards among all the laid out scenery of a park, just as they would have done far from any human interference, in a solitude which must everywhere return to engulf them, springing up out of the necessities of their exposed position, and superimposing itself upon the work of man's hands. And so it was that at the foot of the path which led down to this artificial lake, there might be seen, in its two tiers woven of trailing forget-me-nots below, and of periwinkle flowers above, the natural, delicate blue garland which binds the luminous, shadowed brows of water nymphs, while the iris, its sword sweeping every way in regal profusion, stretched out over agrimony and water-growing kingcups the lilied scepters, tattered glories of yellow and purple, of the kingdom of the lake. The absence of Mademoiselle Swann, which, since it preserved me from the terrible risk of seeing her appear on one of the paths, and of being identified and scorned by this so privileged little girl who had Bergotte for a friend, and used to go with him to visit cathedrals, made the exploration of Tansonville, now for the first time permitted me, a matter of indifference to myself, seemed, however, to invest the property, in my grandfather's and father's eyes, with a fresh and transient charm, and, like an entirely cloudless sky when one is going mountaineering, to make the day extraordinarily propitious for a walk in this direction. I should have liked to see their reckoning proved false, to see, by a miracle, Mademoiselle Swann appear with her father, so close to us that we should not have time to escape, and should therefore be obliged to make her acquaintance. And so, when I suddenly noticed a straw basket lying forgotten on the grass by the side of a line whose float was bobbing in the water, I made a great effort to keep my father and grandfather looking in another direction, away from this sign that she might, after all, be in residence. Still, as Swann had told us that he ought not really to go away just then, as he had some people staying in the house, the line might equally belong to one of these guests. Not a footstep was to be heard on any of the paths. Somewhere in one of the tall trees, making a stage in its height, an invisible bird, desperately attempting to make the day seem shorter, was exploring with a long, continuous note the solitude that pressed it on every side, but it received at once so unanimous an answer, so powerful a repercussion of silence and of immobility, that, one would have said, it had arrested for all eternity the moment which it had been trying to make pass more quickly. The sunlight fell so implacably from a fixed sky that one was naturally inclined to slip away out of the reach of its attentions, and even the slumbering water, whose repose was perpetually being invaded by the insects that swarmed above its surface, while it dreamed, no doubt, of some imaginary maelstrom, intensified the uneasiness which the sight of that floating cork had wrought in me, by appearing to draw it at full speed across the silent reaches of a mirrored firmament, now almost vertical. It seemed on the point of plunging down out of sight, and I had begun to ask myself whether, setting aside the longing and the terror that I had of making her acquaintance, it was not actually my duty to warn Mademoiselle Swann that the fish was biting, when I was obliged to run after my father and grandfather, who were calling me, and were surprised that I had not followed them along the little path, climbing uphill towards the open fields, into which they had already turned. I found the whole path throbbing with the fragrance of hawthorn blossom. The hedge resembled a series of chapels, whose walls were no longer visible under the mountains of flowers that were heaped upon their altars, while underneath the sun cast a square of light upon the ground, as though it had shone in upon them through a window. The scent that swept out over me from them was as rich and as circumscribed in its range as though I had been standing before the Lady Altar, and the flowers, themselves adorned also, held out each its little bunch of glittering stamens with an air of inattention, fine, radiating nerves in the flamboyant style of architecture, like those which, in church, frame the stair to the rood loft, or close the perpendicular tracery of the windows, but here spread out into pools of fleshy white, like strawberries in spring. How simple and rustic, in comparison with these, would seem the dog roses which in a few weeks' time would be climbing the same hillside path in the heat of the sun, dressed in the smooth silk of their blushing pink bodices, which would be undone and scattered by the first breath of wind. But it was in vain that I lingered before the hawthorns, to breathe in, to marshal before my mind, which knew not what to make of it, to lose in order to rediscover their invisible and unchanging odor, to absorb myself in the rhythm which disposed their flowers here and there with the light-heartedness of youth, and at intervals as unexpected as certain intervals of music. They offered me an indefinite continuation of the same charm, in an inexhaustible profusion, but without letting me delve into it any more deeply, like those melodies which one can play over 100 times in succession without coming any nearer to their secret. I turned away from them for a moment so as to be able to return to them with renewed strength. My eyes followed up the slope which, outside the hedge, rose steeply to the fields, a poppy that had strayed and been lost by its fellows, or a few cornflowers that had fallen lazily behind, and decorated the ground here and there with their flowers like the border of a tapestry, in which may be seen at intervals hints of the rustic theme which appears triumphant in the panel itself. Infrequent still, spaced apart as the scattered houses, which warn us that we are approaching a village, they betoken to me the vast expanse of waving corn beneath the fleecy clouds, and the sight of a single poppy hoisting upon its slender rigging and holding against the breeze its scarlet ensign, over the buoy of rich black earth from which it sprang, made my heart beat as does a wayfarer's when he perceives, upon some low-lying ground, an old and broken boat, which is being caulked and made seaworthy, and cries out, although he has not yet caught sight of it, "The sea!" And then I returned to my hawthorns, and stood before them as one stands before those masterpieces of painting which, one imagines, one will be better able to take in when one has looked away for a moment at something else. But in vain did I shape my fingers into a frame, so as to have nothing but the hawthorns before my eyes. The sentiment which they aroused in me remained obscure and vague, struggling and failing to free itself, to float across and become one with the flowers. They themselves offered me no enlightenment, and I could not call upon any other flowers to satisfy this mysterious longing. And then, inspiring me with that rapture which we feel on seeing a work by our favorite painter quite different from any of those that we already know, or, better still, when some one has taken us and set us down in front of a picture of which we have hitherto seen no more than a penciled sketch, or when a piece of music which we have heard played over on the piano bursts out again in our ears with all the splendor and fullness of an orchestra, my grandfather called me to him, and, pointing to the hedge of Tansonville, said, "You are fond of hawthorns. Just look at this pink one. Isn't it pretty?" And it was indeed a hawthorn, but one whose flowers were pink, and lovelier even than the white. It, too, was in holiday attire, for one of those days which are the only true holidays, the holy days of religion, because they are not appointed to any capricious accident, as secular holidays are appointed, upon days which are not specially ordained for such observances, which have nothing about them that is essentially festal. But it was attired even more richly than the rest, for the flowers which clung to its branches, one above another, so thickly as to leave no part of the tree undecorated, like the tassels wreathed about the crook of a rococo shepherdess, were every one of them in color, and consequently of a superior quality, by the aesthetic standards of Combray, to the plain, if one was to judge by the scale of prices at the stores in the square, or at Camus's, where the most expensive biscuits were those whose sugar was pink. And for my own part, I set a higher value on cream cheese when it was pink, when I had been allowed to tinge it with crushed strawberries. And these flowers had chosen precisely the color of some edible and delicious thing, or of some exquisite addition to one's costume for a great festival, which colors, inasmuch as they make plain the reason for their superiority, are those whose beauty is most evident to the eyes of children, and for that reason must always seem more vivid and more natural than any other tints, even after the child's mind has realized that they offer no gratification to the appetite, and have not been selected by the dressmaker. And indeed I had felt at once, as I had felt before the white blossom, but now still more marveling, that it was in no artificial manner, by no device of human construction, that the festal intention of these flowers was revealed, but that it was Nature herself who had spontaneously expressed it, with the simplicity of a woman from a village shop laboring at the decoration of a street altar for some procession, by burying the bush in these little rosettes, almost too ravishing in color, this rustic pompadour. High up on the branches, like so many of those tiny rose trees, their plots concealed in jackets of paper lace, whose slender stems rise in a forest from the altar on the greater festivals, 1,000 buds were swelling and opening, paler in color, but each disclosing as it burst, as at the bottom of a cup of pink marble, its blood-red stain, and suggesting even more strongly than the full-blown flowers the special irresistible quality of the hawthorn tree, which, wherever it budded, wherever it was about to blossom, could bud and blossom in pink flowers alone. Taking its place in the hedge, but as different from the rest as a young girl in holiday attire among a crowd of dowdy women in everyday clothes, who are staying at home, equipped and ready for the month of Mary, of which it seemed already to form a part, it shone and smiled in its cool, rosy garments, a Catholic bush indeed, and altogether delightful. The hedge allowed us a glimpse, inside the park, of an alley bordered with jasmine, pansies, and verbenas, among which the stalks held open their fresh plump purses, of a pink as fragrant and as faded as old Spanish leather, while on the gravel path a long watering pipe, painted green, coiling across the ground, poured, where its holes were, over the flowers whose perfume those holes inhaled, a vertical and prismatic fan of infinitesimal rainbow-colored drops. Suddenly I stood still, unable to move, as happens when something appears that requires not only our eyes to take it in, but involves a deeper kind of perception and takes possession of the whole of our being. A little girl with fair reddish hair, who appeared to be returning from a walk, and held a trowel in her hand, was looking at us, raising towards us a face powdered with pinkish freckles. Her black eyes gleamed, and as I did not at that time know, and indeed have never since learned how to reduce to its objective elements any strong impression, since I had not, as they say, enough power of observation to isolate the sense of their color, for a long time afterwards, whenever I thought of her, the memory of those bright eyes would at once present itself to me as a vivid azure, since her complexion was fair, so much so that perhaps if her eyes had not been quite so black, which was what struck one most forcibly on first meeting her, I should not have been, as I was, especially enamored of their imagined blue. I gazed at her, at first with that gaze which is not merely a messenger from the eyes, but in whose window all the senses assemble and lean out, petrified and anxious, that gaze which would fain reach, touch, capture, bear off in triumph the body at which it is aimed, and the soul with the body. Then, so frightened was I lest at any moment my grandfather and father, catching sight of the girl, might tear me away from her by making me run on in front of them with another and unconsciously appealing look whose object was to force her to pay attention to me, to see, to know me. She cast a glance forwards and sideways, so as to take stock of my grandfather and father, and doubtless the impression she formed of them was that we were all absurd people, for she turned away with an indifferent and contemptuous air, withdrew herself so as to spare her face the indignity of remaining within their field of vision, and while they, continuing to walk on without noticing her, had overtaken and passed me, she allowed her eyes to wander over the space that lay between us, in my direction, without any particular expression, without appearing to have seen me, but with an intensity, a half-hidden smile which I was unable to interpret, according to the instruction I had received in the ways of good breeding, save as a mark of infinite disgust, and her hand, at the same time, sketched in the air an indelicate gesture, for which, when it was addressed in public to a person whom it did not know, the little dictionary of manners which I carried in my mind supplied only one meaning, namely, a deliberate insult. "Gilberte, come along! What are you doing?" called out in a piercing tone of authority a lady in white, whom I had not seen until that moment, while, a little way beyond her, a gentleman in a suit of linen ducks, whom I did not know either, stared at me with eyes which seemed to be starting from his head. The little girl's smile abruptly faded, and seizing her trowel, she made off without turning to look again in my direction, with an air of obedience, inscrutable and sly. End of Part 2, Section 13.